Welcome back, everyone. Laszlo Montgomery here with you again. Up to now, we've looked at Confucian philosophy and legalism. Remember, when you look up Confucianism in the Chinese dictionary, it's simply known as Ru or Rujia. From these 100 schools of thought going back to the spring and autumn period of the Eastern Zhou Dynasty, it was ultimately Confucianism, commencing in the Han Dynasty, that triumphed over all the other schools of thought. So let's begin by taking a look at how Confucianism made the comeback of the century during the reign of Emperor Han Gaozu. After defeating Xiangyu and after his new Han Dynasty was established, Han Gaozu had the Confucian officials draw up a whole master plan detailing how they would manage all palace rituals and ceremonies and how to staff the imperial court and how to manage everything that Qin Shi Huang left behind. Everything that an imperial court might require, down to the imperial regalia and trappings of being an emperor. All of this had to be decided upon and instituted. And once all this was in place, the rough warrior Liu Bang made the transition to regal emperor Han Gaozu of China. Confucianism began to thrive once again, and before long it was safe for everyone to come out. Of the 100 schools of thought that thrived during the Eastern Zhou, many of them didn't make it to the Han. Some got snuffed out during the Qin. There was also some consolidation where rival schools of thought joined together. It wasn't what it used to be, but it was a totally new time. When Han Gaozu sat on the throne in 206 BCE, Confucius had been dead for 273 years. A lot had changed, and people knew a lot more now than they used to. Confucianism's great moment arrived with the Han Emperor Wu, Han Wu Di, 156 to 87 BCE. He was one of China's greatest emperors. He makes it to the top 10 of every list. Our focus is not so much on Emperor Wu as it is the man behind the man. This was another one of the early greats of Chinese culture and history, Dong Zhongshu. He's one of those names like Shen Bu Hai and that. He's also not an A-lister in Chinese history, but he should be. The triumph of Confucianism was mainly due to this person, Dong Zhongshu. And again, it wasn't enough that Confucianism triumphed. Legalism was formally made a scapegoat for all the ills suffered under the Qin. Shangyang, Han Fei, Li Si, they all took a drubbing. And the idea of the mandate of heaven was first mentioned by Dong Zhongshu. This was a theory regarding the interaction between heaven and man, the man being the ruler. Allowing the mandate of heaven to slip through their fingers was the easiest and most obvious cause for the Qin's fall and the Han's rise. The heavenly mandate, as introduced by Dong, was also like a check on the power of the emperor by the bureaucracy. By establishing the idea of this mandate of heaven, this Tianming, it ran both ways. It gave the emperor and ruling house their most important legitimacy, but it also hung over their heads like a sword of Damocles, ready to fall if their fortunes went south, or bad emperors, famines, natural disasters, or invasion started to signal heaven's disfavor. Let me quote from one of Dong's works how he put it, quote, "Heaven establishes kings not on behalf of rulers, but on behalf of the people. Therefore, if his virtue is sufficient to bring security and happiness to the people, heaven bestows the mandate on him. If his evil is sufficient to injure and harm the people, heaven withdraws this mandate." End quote. Under Han Wu Di and with Dong Zhongshu's stewardship, an imperial university was established in 124 BCE, which focused on Confucian teachings. And from this university emerged all these Han-era Confucianist scholars who went on to populate the entirety of the imperial bureaucracy, administration, courts, everywhere. Confucianism reigned. All these officials who came from this university had to pass what we know as the civil service exams. This was also a creation of Dong Zhongshu. These exams institutionalized the meritocracy already put in place during the Qin by the legalists, and these Zhou-era Confucian classics became the required texts. These texts were, during Dong Zhongshu's period of service to the emperor, for the first time grouped together and classified as the Yi Jing, the 5 classics, which were the Book of Odes, Book of Documents, Book of Rites, the Yi Jing, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. These were the 5 books you had to master if you had any hope of joining the ranks of the civil service. So we could see how Confucianism attained its preeminence during the reign of Han Wudi and with the help of his chief minister, Dong Zhongshu, and the magical year was 136 BCE. That's when Confucianism, by proclamation, became the state ideology. Confucianism had come under attack almost as soon as Master Kong passed away in 479 BCE. The Moists and others, including the legalists, had pounded hard on Confucianism. Yeah, this Ru school took its lumps, but now it had prevailed over its rival philosophies thanks to its great champion, Dong Zhongshu. Sacrifices were decreed in Confucius's honor. His texts were engraved in stone. Confucianism would henceforth always remain the philosophy of the aristocracy. But unlike before the Han Dynasty, the aristocracy was not limited to the nobility. To make it nowadays, all you needed was real talent and virtue. If you were smart and talented enough to climb the ladder, you too could become one of the beautiful people. Part of the Han Emperor's conquest involved the 111 BCE defeat of the Nanyue Kingdom down in the southernmost region of China, Guangdong, Guangxi. Further south of them was a place called Yunnan, or south of Yue, which we call Vietnam today. The Chinese went into Vietnam, and from that point on, starting in the Han, with a break here and there through the centuries, there were 4 periods when China dominated, or at the very least heavily influenced, Vietnam court politics. That's why Confucianism caught on in Vietnam like no other place in Southeast Asia. Same with Daoism and Mahayana Buddhism. Same could be said of Chinese writing as well. The current Vietnamese writing system only became widespread maybe a century ago. I won't get into this right now, but starting right about here, the rivalry between the Confucianists in the government and those of the Taoist persuasion began to heat up a notch here. By Han Wudi's time, it had been about 400 years since Lao Tzu's time, and a century and a half since Zhuangzi. So you could say Taoism by now was somewhat mature and had spread far and wide, including into the halls of power. Pretty soon, the Buddhists will also throw their hat into the ring. Dong Zhongshu is also credited with the idea of correlative Confucianism. Here's where philosophy takes on a new twist. Dong Zhongshu came up with a theory that combined yin and yang and the 5 elements, the Wu Xing, with Confucian thought. He was looking to shine a spotlight on the correlation between human behavior and heaven's will, the interrelatedness of the cosmos and human nature. Tian, or heaven, and human beings were both comprised of the forces of yin and yang, which therefore means there was an intrinsic connection between heaven and people through the movement and interaction of these forces. Dong believed that heaven, Tian, was both a natural phenomenon and a god of sorts that expressed human will, always trying to warn or reward humankind with all the signs of heaven's pleasure or displeasure. Dong Zhongshu wrote that the universe was broken down into 10 parts: heaven, earth, yin, yang, the 5 elements of wood, fire, soil, metal, and water, and humankind. And because people were one of the 10, Dong Zhongshu said cosmology and Confucianism both had an influence on the human and natural worlds. Everything was interrelated, tied together by the forces of yin and yang. The universe, taught Dong Zhongshu, was filled with these ethers of yin and yang, and humans were immersed in these ethers. Change was happening constantly, and everyone was affected by everything. Yeah, the Confucianism of the Han was not the same as how they practiced it in the late Zhou, and we'll see it was an evolving ideology. After the shakeup that happened in the world of Chinese philosophy during the Qin, it ultimately fell on the shoulders of Sima Tan, father of Sima Qian, to sort out the surviving schools of philosophy, to divide them all up and introduce the main ideas each one espoused. This is where we get that neat and tidy bundle of the 6 schools of philosophy. According to Sima Tan, they were the Yin-Yang school, the school of names, the Ru school, the Moist, legalism, and what he called the Dao school, but was actually the Daoist school. No one up to Sima Tan's time was calling anyone a Daoist yet, but now that these myriad of different schools had all been sorted out, Daoism, or Daojia, finally had a specific classification. This would later on be further enhanced by the great Confucian scholar Liu Xin. He lived 46 BCE to 23 CE, the time of Augustus in Rome and Jesus in the Holy Land. This period was also the final years of the Western Han. Liu Xin is remembered for a few things. Firstly, he was curator of the Imperial Library and oversaw an entire makeover of the library, organizing all the surviving Chinese classics and commentaries. Liu Xin took the 100 schools and further divided them into 10 schools. These were the same 6 as mentioned by Sima Tan, plus the schools of diplomats, eclectics, agrarians, and storytellers, who were noted as the least important of the 10. Liu Xin explained that these schools all had their origins in different classes of society. He said that the Ru school came from the Ministry of Education. These were the Confucianists mostly. They were all proficient in the Liu Yi, the 6 arts: rites, music, archery, charioteering, calligraphy, and mathematics. These are among the subjects that a typical Confucian scholar would be proficient in. Liu Xin said they also stood for human-heartedness and held the ancients in the highest possible esteem. The Daoists came from the official historians. The Yin-Yang school came from among the astronomers. The legalists, no surprise, came from the Ministry of Justice. The school of names came from the Ministry of Ceremonies. The Moists were the temple guardians. The diplomat school came from the Ministry of Embassies. The eclectic school from the counselors who dabbled in multiple ideologies, and the agrarian school came from the Ministry of Soil and Grains, and the storytellers came from the petty offices and concerned itself mostly with word on the street. So the Han Dynasty really took an inventory of all their philosophy, cosmology, and different schools of thought, and got everything all organized and categorized for the first time. 2 people emerged during the Han who I wanted to mention, and they showed how Confucianism was constantly evolving as people became smarter, and new theories were espoused regarding human beings and the forces of heaven and nature. That Confucian app, it needed an update every so often as new ideas gained followers and acceptance. Let's look at Wang Chong. He's a nice example of some of the many new ideas and discoveries that have been packed on to all the philosophic thought inherited from the Zhou. By the Han, there were a lot of philosophers who went far beyond the thought that came from Confucius, Mengzi, and Xunzi too. All kinds of cool stuff was being discovered and argued and refuted. During this exciting time, there was a split that occurred within the Confucianist doctrine. 2 schools emerged. The Old Text School was headed up by Yang Xiong and Wang Chong. They held most sacred those books that had come from the Zhou that had managed to survive the book-burning drama of the Qin in 213 BCE. And these texts were written in the old style. The The new text school, on the other hand, used versions of the classics that were more modern and in the style of the Western Han. Yang Xiong, not an influential figure, but he is remembered for his belief that human nature is neither originally good, like Mengzi says, nor as bad as what Xunzi said. Yang Xiong argued that a person's nature came about as a mixture of both. Wang Chong's work is contained in a source known as the Lunheng, or Balanced Discussions. If there's a word that defined Wang Chong, I suppose you could say it was skepticism. Maybe rationalism, too. He let it all hang out in the Lunheng, spewing forth his doubts in every direction, even questioning Confucius himself and rejecting Han Feizi altogether. He insisted that those who came before them should be accepted outright without asking some difficult questions. For example, he attacked the yin-yang school's doctrine that a nexus existed between heaven and man. Wang Chong had written that people's place in the universe is like that of a flea or a louse under a jacket or robe. If people acted improperly or properly, morally or immorally, it didn't do anything to change the world. A flea cannot effect changes, and neither can man. That was the main thing Wang Chong taught in his thought. We can't change heaven, and heaven sure as heck isn't going to go out of its way to change us. He was not a believer in divine will. He particularly focused some of his rage against the belief in ghosts. You can have spirits, but he drew the line at those who passed away and came back as ghosts. The rationalist in Wang Chong said, if this was the case, more people had died in history than were living in his day. So that reasoning right away gave the idea of the dead returning as spirits and ghosts a bad smell in Wang Chong's opinion. Wang Chong was one of those polymath types who knew a lot about everything. In fact, the great 20th century scholar of the history of Chinese science, Joseph Needham, he spoke at length about Wang Chong's contributions to astronomy, irrigation, and meteorology in particular. Like a lot of people who are extremely brilliant and have high IQs, Wang Chong found it hard to get along with those officials he rubbed elbows with. He had this outrage about what Chinese philosophy had degraded to in his time. Confucianism had been made the state ideology by Han Wudi for over 100 years already. Confucius was worshipped as a god. The way Wang Chong saw Daoism, it had mostly degraded into a religion filled with superstition, lucky talismans, and too many people making money as feng shui masters. Wang Chong really turned his nose up at this. But despite all the resistance, Daoism was having a real growth spurt during the Han. Emperor Huan, who reigned 146 to 168, even had a temple built at Lao Tzu's birthplace where people could go and venerate him. Wang Chong was going around saying that all those old books and commentaries about the sages needed to be reevaluated and should never be accepted at face value. For example, he pointed at something as common as the rain. Wang Chong said that the Confucianists will have you believe that the rain came from the heavens. But if you study the rain closely, it rains down from a position just above the earth, not from heaven. He had a lot to say about qi. Now, we're going to explore the concept of qi in detail in a future episode. But qi is defined as gas, air, breath, smell, weather, and vital energy. It has a lot of meanings, but the one we care most about is the qi that any living thing possesses, their vital life force. And qi interacts with the 5 elements and with yin and yang, and that, ladies and gentlemen, brings you everything there is in the world as we know it. As I said, we've all heard about qi. That's the same word qi as in qi gong, and you've heard of that perhaps. It's already part and parcel of Chinese philosophy in the Han, but qi, the 5 elements, yin and yang, they all play an even greater role in Chinese philosophy as we move along the historical timeline. Okay, let's put our things away and close up shop. For these past 9 episodes, we've mostly looked at the history of pre-Confucian and Confucian philosophy as well as legalism. We looked at Confucius and those who followed him. He wasn't everyone's cup of tea, and as you'll soon see when we explore Daoism, he's downright vilified in some ways. Until then, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California, thanking each and every one of you for listening and for supporting me. I look forward to seeing you once again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.